The most inspiring stories from today's leaders in health and fitness. Join Rose in today's show. Welcome to the Paleo Diet Magazine Show with your host, Rose.
Nora Gedgaudas is a widely recognized expert on what is properly referred to as the paleo diet. She is the author of the international best-selling book, Primal Body, Primal Mind, Beyond the Paleo Diet for Total Health and a Longer Life. She is also a highly successful, experienced nutritional consultant, speaker, and educator, widely interviewed on national and international radio, popular podcasts, television, and film. She maintains a private practice in Portland, Oregon, as both a board-certified nutritional consultant and a board-certified clinical neurofeedback specialist.
Long time no talk.
Nora Gedgaudas, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you, Rosetta. It's an honor to be here.
We are delighted to have you as well. So let's get started. We have read from your bio that your family are very well known in the field of medicine, especially your dad. One would expect that naturally you would be a doctor as well. Tell me about the moment you realized that medicine was not for you.
Boy, I think it was more of a collection of moments. I was pre-med for a period of time. In college, it was just sort of expected that I would follow in my father's footsteps. But I found myself less than inspired, I guess, by mainstream medicine. It wasn't something that ignited me. I was much more interested in. It seemed more logical to me to be focused on preventative measures than addressing symptoms. Merely addressing symptoms with the use of pharmaceutical agents and expensive medical procedures. Mm. And so logically, it just never really appealed to me. And so it was something I felt compelled to move away from. But my older sister is a radiologist, and she's married to a radiologist. And my younger sister is also married to a radiologist. And of course, my father was a very well-known radiologist, and so I had a lot of exposure to not just sort of the medical industry growing up, but also that way of thinking was something that pervaded our home, and virtually everybody my parents had anything to do with were associated with the medical. With the medical field. And so I definitely had more than my fair share of exposure to that. And these weren't my people,
Okay.
so to speak.
Okay. What were your thoughts about that when you said they weren't your people? What drove you to go a different direction?
Yeah. Again, I see Western medicine is something that views the human body is a compartmentalized sort of collection of body parts, and it's you have your radiologist, you have urologists, nephrologists, you have psychiatrists, you have cardiologists, you have neurologists, you have all these different arenas, so to speak, all these different compartmentalized arenas that don't really interconnect with one another particularly well, and don't really grasp that there are aspects of overlap, to many of these different areas. That the human body is this extremely complex interrelationship, if you will, comprised of this sort of very complex interrelationship and of everything from, hormones and neurotransmitters and other types of processes, and that you can't really compartmentalize out the human body in that way. And if there is a set of symptoms, to me, that's nobody has a Prozac deficiency, right? Nobody has a deficiency of specific medications that are being used to so-called treat and cure various illnesses. And of the top 300 or so medications that are prescribed today, not one single one of them actually serves to support natural physiological functioning. They're all there to basically ameliorate a specific symptom, all while also coming with their own litany of potential side effects and complications. And to me, conventional medicine is just sort of looking in the wrong places in the wrong way. Now, functional medicine has come along, and it's better, but it still has a ways to go. Somewhere around World War II, medicine really, though, ceased to become a profession and became an industry, largely dictated by the interests of pharmaceutical companies. And to this day, it is a profit-oriented industry that benefits very little from improved health, among those that are relying upon it, except for, and I will certainly make this glowing exception, emergency medicine. Okay. Catastrophic medicine. If I get hit by a bus, the first place I will want to go is a hospital emergency room, and particularly here, in the States and whatever. I mean, this is really the crown jewel of Western medicine as far as I'm concerned, is emergency medicine. But when it comes to chronic or degenerative or terminal illnesses, I think that the model is somewhat lacking, to put it mildly. Okay. And I'm a dot connector. I like to see the interrelationship between things. I like to, as I said, connect the dots between things and understand what is underlying the various, various things that people experience as problems or symptoms. To me, it's all about digging deeper and deeper and deeper until you get to a foundational issue. Okay. And to me, what we eat is about as foundational as it gets, in addition to the kinds of things that we might be exposed to in terms of chemicals or other substances in our environment. So that's the way my thinking works. And I just never felt particularly inspired by that compartmentalized sort of Newtonian, if you will, worldview, which I think has become outmoded. And yet the profession persists with that model, that outdated model.
Okay. Now, you said you like to connect the dots, and I know you have a passion for neural feedback. Can you tell me about the day when you decided to use paleo in conjunction with neural feedback?
Well, neurofeedback, to me, gets at the root. I mean, it's a bit of an involved question, because I'm guessing most of your audience may not understand what neurofeedback is. It's a process by which a person gets better control of their own state management and the bioelectric functioning of their brain and nervous system through the act of basically exercising your own brainwave activity in a highly specific sort of way. This field has been around for a very long time now. Certainly since the early 70s, there's been quite a lot of research going on in this arena. But it has a very broad range of efficacy for anything that's basically under the that is associated with the central nervous system. Any kind of symptom that has under the governance in some way, shape, or form of the central nervous system can stand to be positively impacted by neurofeedback. And it's basically all about giving the brain information about its own functioning in a totally non-invasive way so that it can better manage its own states. so that it can function in a more stable and robust kind of manner. And what drove me toward all of this, actually, was what had been for me a lifetime of struggle with severe and chronic, depression, and which later ended up moving into more anxiety and panic attacks and things like that as time went on. And it was quite debilitating throughout the better part of my life. Mm-hmm. And I discovered paleo right about the same time. I mean, mind you, my interest in nutrition had spanned close to 35 years, and I've been involved in the field of neurofeedback and have been studying kind of an evolutionary approach to diet for more than 20 years now. But it was stumbling across, the work of initially Weston Price that kind of triggered an interest in digging a little deeper and going back further along ancestral lines, because to me that made all the sense in the world as to, when you have to ask the question, what is the optimal human diet? Well, it would have to be in alignment with what we had habitually consumed as a species throughout the better part of our evolutionary history. And that would have certainly served to establish our physiological makeup and our basic nutritional requirements. So I set off down that path. But with neurofeedback, we're talking about the bioelectric part of the brain. Mm-hmm. Exercising the mechanisms by which the brain's intrinsic rhythms are established. And to me, both are very foundational approaches to things. Mm-hmm. Stress and trauma, can generate timing dysregulation in the brain. But I also discovered that you can be doing the best possible protocol in the world for a person using neurofeedback. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I'm astonished at how much mileage I can get from neurofeedback alone, even when I know that a person is suffering other either deficiency-related problems or they're maybe having immune reactivity issues. Neurofeedback can go a long ways toward improving the way a person feels and functions, even under those circumstances. But what became clear to me is that, that all the best brain training in the world, it's not going to put a nutrient there that's not there. It's not going to take away some offending substance that doesn't belong there, that the brain and the nervous system absolutely require certain raw materials in order to function. And what I have discovered with respect to my own work with clients over the last 20 years or so as a neurofeedback provider is that the more we can come to address both sides of that coin, the biochemical side of that coin based on foundational dietary principles, and addressing the bioelectric side of the coin by training basically the brain's rhythms. Mm-hmm. It's almost a foolproof combination. The two work very well together, and it's because of the foundational nature of both of these procedures, both of which are extremely natural, both of which are, basically not harmful, right? Mm-hmm. Non-invasive.
So you're speaking of the left brain and the right brain?
Speaking of the whole brain.
The whole brain.
I mean, there's the left and right hemisphere. There are numerous structures within the brain with respect to neurofeedback in different areas of the brain, of the cortex in particular. That the gray slab on top of, the older part of the brain, mm-hmm. are localized for different functions. And so based on the kinds of symptoms or issues a person might present, we adjust placement with the electrode sensors to put the brain's focus on its attention to those specific areas, but not just those specific areas, the relationship between those areas. So typically there is more than one sensor placed on the scalp at a time in one of these localized areas. Mm-hmm. And it's not just the training of those areas, but of the interplay between those two areas that seems to best improve functionality.
Okay. Is there an age level that you would use this neural feedback on?
I've worked with 2.5-year-old brain-injured infants. I've worked with 89-year-old Alzheimer's patients.
Wow.
And everything in between.
Okay.
My practice was roughly half and half, or has been roughly half and half, adults and kids.
Okay.
So at any age, the brain has enormous capacity for, what they call plasticity, for its ability to be able to modify its own activity based on having the appropriate information to do so. And neurofeedback is really all about, pointing the mirror in the right direction at the right angle, so to speak.
Okay. What was the vision you had for yourself when you started neurofeedback, the journey, neurofeedback?
Well, the neurofeedback, I basically sought it out as, I had developed an interest in the field of neurotechnology a couple years beforehand, and ended up being led more or less to the field of neurofeedback itself. And I became acquainted with one of the most important pioneers of the field, a man by the name of Dr. Siegfried Othmer, who at the time was head of EEG Spectrum, the founder and head of EEG Spectrum, and later left EEG Spectrum to form the Brian Othmer Foundation and the EEG Institute, which is where the Othmers are presently. And that is where I think the best, most cutting-edge information is actually coming out of. And Siegfried had a tremendous impact on me. He's one of the most brilliant human beings I've ever known in my life, bar none. And he strongly encouraged me to pursue the field of neurofeedback, felt that I would be a natural for it. And I was still struggling with some of the issues surrounding depression, even though I was getting some interesting results doing things with my diet and doing things with other brain tools, so to speak. And I sought out a practitioner that he recommended for me in Minneapolis at the time, which is where I was living. And it was literally after the second session, I felt what had been a lifetime of feelings of helplessness and hopelessness literally flew out the window and never came back. Mind you, I did about 40 sessions to make that a permanent part of my nervous system, because the ultimate effect of the training is cumulative in nature. Mm-hmm. You can feel fabulous after the first session, but it takes time for the brain to learn. There's a conditioning process and a skill building process. The brain is learning how to manage its own states. Okay. So it takes a lot of repetition and sometimes adjusting placements throughout the course of a session in order to bring in the parts of the brain that are most indicated for whatever the person happens to be struggling with. So, but ultimately, it was a permanent fix for me. I mean, this was 20 years ago, and depression has ostensibly been a non-issue since then. And mind you, I also very strongly believed that what I was doing dietarily at the time, the changes I was making to my diet and my awareness along those lines and the application of that awareness were probably the strongest factor in optimizing the results that I got from neurofeedback. Okay. And it certainly has, I knew by hook or by crook I wanted to be part of what went on in that field, because it was so transformative for me. My life bears no resemblance to what it was prior to neurofeedback now. That it was so transformative for me that I felt, I think, both a passion and a feeling of almost duty and responsibility, having learned everything I had, to help others who were similarly suffering. Wow! And so and nutrition has always played some significant part in that. Virtually always there. I get the clients who come in and say, I know you do this other thing, but I'm mainly just interested in the neurofeedback. That's fine. And I had people come to me doing, with the other perspective of, I know there's that neurofeedback thing, but I'm mainly interested in a consultation about, what I should be taking, what I should be doing nutritionally, etc.
Wow. There's an emotion in your voice. What do you make of that?
There's a what?
Emotion in your voice.
I'm very passionate about this.
Okay.
It's an emotional topic from the standpoint of a very deeply feeling topic, I think is the better way of putting it for me, that I'm very passionate about the idea of seeing people feeling self-empowered, of coming to a place where they no longer need me in order to get out and be able to have wonderful lives, to be able to be in the driver's seat of their own brain and nervous system and their own health in the best possible way. To me, the only way to get there is to think foundationally and functionally. And I also believe it's hard to take anybody further than you've gone yourself. And I, certainly was brought to a lot of what I know through some of my own issues and interests, and also issues affecting people close to me.
Yes. Okay. What are the steps that got you from depression to neurofeedback assistant to where you are right now?
Right. Wow. So I think I knew I was first depressed when I was about 5 years old. Was sort of having feelings like I wish I'd never been born kind of thing. By the time I was in my teens, I spent a lot of time just sort of wishing I was dead. And there was a lot of suicidal ideation, a lot of angst. I know that sort of comes with adolescence, but it was angst that was paralytic for me often enough. But somehow I always knew that there was an answer to that somehow, some way, there was either some deep flaw in myself I needed to reveal and unearth and somehow deal with or have fixed somehow, or there was an answer. I knew that life didn't have to be that way. It's just that it sort of was. And I was always driven toward an interest in things that could change the way I felt and functioned. And nutrition was one of the earliest things I ever discovered for that. And nutritional supplements more specifically. I found myself reading a lot of different books and nutrition almanacs and just a lot of material that I could get my hands on about that. And I learned that I could, in some ways, change the way I felt by things that I took. But I was also interested in a lot of other self-help stuff. And there were a lot of other issues in my life, as I've been fond of saying many times, that I think stress and trauma will shove us off whatever cliff we happen to be standing next to. I think I probably had some kind of genetic predisposition toward, when I got pushed, going over the slippery slope that was depression, where for somebody else it might be mania, or it might be alcoholism, or it might be migraines or IBS or whatever. And there were certainly a lot of things going on in my life that were consistent with those kinds of triggers. There were slippery slopes that I toppled over into depression. And so I sought out psychotherapy for quite a number of years, and kind of went like a bee from flower to flower, from psychotherapist to psychotherapist, psychologist, psychiatrists. Back in those days, I was fortunate that psychiatrists weren't the sort of pill people that they are now. But I also found that there wasn't a lot of value in the kind of psychotherapy that I was getting. I got some relief from being able to talk about things, but I wasn't getting a lot of insight. And then I finally found an individual who had themselves kind of been through the ringer in life, and they had managed to emerge on the other side of that intact. In other words, they'd done their own work, which I find all too often many psychotherapists don't bother to do. They come to some sort of intellectual grasp of psychological theory and then somehow feel that they have transcended the need to do their own work. And that wasn't true of this one person that I finally found, who really had come a long ways in their own psyche, and they were able to offer me quite a lot of insight into my own. So I will be forever grateful to that particular therapist. We did a lot of wonderful work, but we still kept hitting a wall. that neither of us could really identify at the time. And later on, I recognized as being this physiological underpinning that was depression for me. Okay. That it wasn't just simply about talking about my problems or my history or whatever have you, and coming to all kinds of insights and places of sort of emotional integration that were just going to fix it all. That there seemed to be a point which that I couldn't quite get past, and we both sort of scratched our heads and kind of let that go, and I found myself continuing to struggle with that. I read a ton of self-help books. I did all this deep inner spiritual work, spent time at mountaintops and in remote wilderness places, and I studied NLP. I spent a week working with Tony Robbins, and
wow.
I did all of these, tried acupuncture and, tried a lot of different approaches to things that seemed to make sense to try. And I learned something. I got a new kind of layer of understanding about myself. Certainly all that work served greatly to improve my relationship with myself and my relationship with other people in the world. I ceased to relate to the world from a place of angst, and instead learned to develop rich and rewarding relationships. And again, including with myself.
Okay.
But I still struggled with those feelings of, waking up certain mornings and just not feeling like getting out of bed, and not really feeling like I could function or like I could get very much accomplished.
Okay.
And it would come and go. And as I got older, these bouts became more frequent. They became more prolonged. And it started to feel after a while almost, what's the point? I kept likening it to the feeling of swimming with ankle weights on all the time.
Okay.
That I'd get up ahead of steam from time to time. I'd have a surge of interest in something, or just there would be something that would come along, or I would just simply be in a place of remission where I could get to the surface and get a few gulps of air and make some headway. And then I would start to feel the familiar tug. And next thing I know, I'd be sitting on the bottom of the ocean again, of this sort of deep, dark place, and thinking, why even bother? And that's the helplessness and hopelessness piece that is depression. And and then I actually went the medication route for a period of time. Probably tried a variety of SSRIs over the course of a year or so, and I didn't feel that I was less depressed so much as I cared about the depression less. It was a flatter place. I wasn't having the low lows, but I wasn't having the high highs of life either that are normal to have. And that I knew that whatever the answer was, it didn't lie in a pill.
Okay.
And so I decided to discontinue all of that. Became very disillusioned with that whole, with the promise of this, serotonin reuptake inhibitor types of medications that were being, written about in books like Listening to Prozac and whatever else. It just all sounded so promising, and ultimately it really wasn't. And then I was really depressed because I'm thinking, okay, I've exhausted everything I can think of. And then I read an article in Omni magazine way back when. I don't know if you remember Omni or not. Yes. It was a cool magazine.
Yeah.
And there was an article on this newly emerging field of neurotechnology. And the concepts being discussed in the article were extremely interesting to me because they underscored the idea of the brain and nervous system not just simply being this hodgepodge of psychological constructs or this vessel of chemical soup that we think of it as, but the brain is also bioelectric. And it is, every biochemical reaction in the body and brain are preceded by what can be called an electrical depolarization of each cell. And that electrical depolarization is dependent on certain timing mechanisms to be functioning properly. And if they aren't, those timing mechanisms may not function properly enough to send the right messages at the right time, and therefore you have, quote-unquote, dysregulation. And the aspect of the brain that controls these timing mechanisms is sort of the pacemaker for a brain, is a structure deep in the brain called the thalamus.
Okay.
And in the thalamus, there are these cells that rise up out of it, these pyramidal cells, these specialized neurons called pyramidal cells, that rise up through half dozen layers of cortical tissue and emerge on the surface as these pyramidal neurons that are emitting what we see as the electroencephalogram, the EEG.
Okay.
And it is using that EEG as a training tool, not as a prescriptive thing, but just simply as a tool that one can use to get at these timing mechanisms and exercise it in a specific way that seems to have a global effect on impacting the way the brain functions.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're giving the brain information that is appropriate for itself, it is able to kind of see its own activity in the mirror, if you will, of what you are looking at when you're sitting there in a chair and you have these electrode sensors attached to your scalp, and these wires come into an amplifier that then amplifies the signal so that the therapist can then see the raw EEG up on the screen. Okay. And then the therapist then basically issues a set of challenges for that person, kind of sets up a protocol for that brain, like a workout, if you will, for the brain. Okay. And what the person in the chair is actually seeing, they're sitting in front of what looks like a computer monitor with video type images on it. It may look like some kind of video game, or it could literally be a DVD of some sort. Mm-hmm. And the feedback is actually kind of embedded in the software that runs that imagery. And so there are thousands, actually, over the course of a session, of subtle cues that give the brain information about its own functioning in real time during the course. Now, the conscious mind is really kind of an irrelevant participant in this equation, which type A personality adults have a hard time dealing with. They really want to know. They're used to bending things to their will. They want to know how it works. They want to try to manipulate it somehow. It kind of doesn't work on that level. These things are happening very instantaneously, and the brain is seeing itself in a mirror and saying, wow, I do that. Sort of like if you're walking down a city street and you have a little backache and you can't quite figure out, why your back is hurting. And then you walk in front of a department store window and you see yourself walking hunched over like Quasimodo. Immediately you think, oh, well, no wonder. And you sort of straighten up. Mm-hmm. And nobody had to tell you how to do that. You just suddenly in that moment had information that led you to an obvious solution, obvious way of adjusting yourself so that you could feel better. And that's a little bit analogous to how this process works. So it's my job as the person doing the training or setting up the training for the person to make sure that the mirrors are pointed in the right direction at the right angles, and that the person is reporting the kinds of shifts in their state that we're hoping to see. Okay. And I rely on their feedback to let me know what it is I need to do to adjust the training to improve their response ongoing.
Does this training have anything to do with the adrenal function?
Well, it's sort of like the ultimate form of stress management in many respects. So anything you can do to mitigate stress is going to go a long ways toward improving the functioning of your adrenals in the process. And of course, I wrote a book called Rethinking Fatigue, what your adrenals are really telling you and what you can do about it. And in it, I merely touched upon neurofeedback as one of the ways in which a person can get a better grip on their brain's response to stress, which is really the bottom line when it comes to adrenal function. The adrenals are just two little hormone factories sitting on top of your kidneys. Mm-hmm. They do basically what they're told to do by your brain. Okay. And so brain dysregulation is easily the single most consequential issue when it comes to what people think of as adrenal dysregulation or adrenal fatigue or adrenal burnout or whatever you want to call it. It almost never has anything to do with the glands themselves.
Okay.
So anything you can do to optimize the functioning of the brain is going to go a long ways toward improving the way your adrenals function.
Mm-hmm.
And one form of training that I did for virtually everybody that ever came through my office was some form of temporal lobe training. And now the temporal lobe is the area of your brain just over the tops of your ears and the sides of your head there, are the part of the brain that are most responsible for mitigating stress response.
Okay.
And that part of your brain also has the richest repository of cortisol receptors in your brain.
Okay.
Now,
so if a person would massage this area when they're under stress, would it help? No. Okay.
No. Well, what neurofeedback is doing is giving that part of the brain a specific stimulus. And in the case of a person with overtaxed adrenal function, where the brain is constantly spinning out of control with anxiety and stress, it's a way of basically calming the activity in that part of the brain in a way that can help that part of the brain simply function more efficiently and be less prone to being marinated in cortisol 24/7. And as we know, cortisol is a catabolic hormone. There's anabolic, which builds things up, and there's catabolic, which breaks things down. Mm-hmm. And we're not designed to be marinated in stress 24/7. This is not how we evolved as a species. Stress was something that was supposed to occur for us in a punctuated fashion. Mm-hmm. You're walking through the woods, everything's hunky-dory, suddenly a saber-toothed tiger jumps out from behind the bush and chases you around. That's a state of emergency, and hopefully your adrenals kick into gear, that shoots up your blood sugar, gives you that burst of rocket fuel to hopefully help you outlive that ordeal, so that then your brain can go back to its, picking up its little umbrella drink and sitting on the nice white sandy beach again, which is where we're really supposed to be 99.99% of the time. But things have really flip-flopped in the world in which we live in today. We've got people running around being chased by saber-toothed tigers 24/7. And then the other 0.1% of the time, if they're lucky enough to get this fabled thing called a quote-unquote vacation, they'll go someplace like Tahiti to try to get away from it all. And they just sort of end up stressing out the Tahitians, and then they come back to their, whatever their former life and propensity for self-abuse was. And this is no way for any of us to live. And even in relatively young people now, radiologists are starting to find temporal lobes that are looking like Swiss cheese from chronic stress. And they're starting to call this now a normal variant of aging. And there's nothing normal about it simply because it is common. So it's deeply problematic. I would say that temporal lobe degeneration is probably the single most common source of adrenal dysregulation that I have run into. And you can find this by doing something called an ASI. It's a salivary hormone panel. It's adrenal stress index is what that stands for, where you take a number of salivary samples throughout the day, and within those salivary samples are active levels of, specifically looking at your cortisol circadian rhythms and your cortisol load, to see whether you're producing the appropriate amounts of cortisol at the appropriate times of the day or not. And in a person with temporal lobe degeneration, what you have is an ASI graph that looks like a roller coaster ride. That the circadian rhythm is all over the place. These are people that can't fall asleep, or they can't stay asleep, or what you end up finding, because the temporal lobes are also the part of the brain, or the hippocampus most specifically, which is part of the temporal lobe, that is responsible for the integration of short-term to long-term memory, for instance. You find a lot of forgetfulness associated with that type of degeneration. You have people with memory problems. Oh, gee, why did I just walk into this room? Where did I park my car? Oh, you live with me. What's your name again? We have these. Everybody calls them the senior moments. We joke about it, but it's no laughing matter, because what it is pointing to is, at the very least, early signs of degeneration in that part of the brain. And that is the first part of the brain to show degenerative signs in conditions like Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to take those signs and symptoms very seriously. That form of adrenal dysregulation is something that needs to be aggressively addressed. And I talk about the ways in which other ways in which you can identify what type of adrenal dysregulation you may be struggling with, because there can be some similarities between them. And what specifically, based on what you feel you screened for, are the steps that you might want to take to test further, to further verify that, and also what you can do to improve improve that particular situation, improve that particular dysregulation.
Okay.
So that's what my book, Rethinking Fatigue, was one that, as I found myself in increased demand for one-on-one consultations and having less and less time to do those, I realized the need, still feeling very passionate about wanting to supply people with self-empowering information, to write something that could kind of replace me in the equation.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
To just be able to hand them this thing and say, okay,
mm-hmm.
here's what I would have done if you'd have walked into my office.
Okay.
Here are the ways to think about this. These are the things to consider. These are the different areas to look at, the different potential problems that you might have. And here are the things you can do about it once you figure out what's really going on with you. These are the tests to take.
Okay.
All of that. It's pretty comprehensive.
Okay.
So.
Okay. Now, earlier you had mentioned something about nutrition.
Yes.
Can you share with our audience what dietary changes you made in your transformation?
Yes. So, basically, well, obviously, as this is for an e-zine called the Paleo Diet Magazine, that I do view things from a very, my book, Primal Body, Primal Mind, was basically taking an evolutionary approach to the whole concept of diet and health. However, it's kind of a modified evolutionary approach that I found myself asking the question that just because our ancestors did something, is that a good enough reason for us to do things the exact same way now? And how would we know? And what I realized I needed to do was use something our ancestors didn't have access to in the same way, which was modern day science, in order to get to the bottom of what specifically about these sort of paleo principles could we best apply toward the optimization of our health. Obviously, there were a lot of things we were able to stick in our mouths, chew up and swallow that didn't kill us, that allowed us to survive. But I don't necessarily think that all of those things that were available to us in their natural form were necessarily all optimally healthy for us,
mm-hmm.
Or all healthy for us in the same way. And so one of the first places I looked was human longevity research, which seemed to me a logical place to look. What are some of the principles that seem to lead to a longer and healthier life? Because if you're living longer, you're basically freer of disease.
Mm-hmm.
And there are certain principles that overlap or that can overlap. And what I discovered was that there are two basically metabolic pathways in the body that regulate how long we live and how healthy we are, more so than anything else. I mean, I'm really throwing this in a big nutshell because I go into it in quite a bit of detail in my book, Primal Body, Primal Mind.
Mm-hmm.
But the two metabolic pathways involved in this are insulin, which really isn't a blood sugar hormone. It's more about the coordination of our energy stores with reproduction and lifespan. And another metabolic pathway that was really only discovered in some recent years called mTOR, mammalian target rapamycin, which is basically a protein sensor.
Mm-hmm.
And that as we upregulate, when we do things to stimulate both insulin and mTOR really only gets stimulated when we consume protein above and beyond what we actually need for our maintenance and repair. that we stimulate cellular proliferation in a way that goes about in a highly energetic fashion, trying to produce new cells, but really at the expense of the ones we already have in some respects. And so if we can minimize our need for activating those two metabolic pathways, what gets upregulated instead is maintenance and repair. And that is what is literally anti-aging. And it is the mechanism behind why caloric restriction worked over so many decades of research into longevity, with everything from yeast to primates, in research of everything from yeast to primates. The one thing that seemed to work consistently well at extending normal healthy lifespans, and sometimes radically, was something called caloric restriction, but they didn't understand what the mechanisms were. They just well, why would eating less be somehow beneficial? Well, it turned out that it was those mechanisms that were being impacted. Interestingly, dietary fat really didn't play into that at all. And it was really sugars. Sugars are sugars and starches, which are sugars when they hit your bloodstream, and proteins that were responsible for activating those metabolic pathways in a way that could serve to shorten our lives, and that seemed to downregulate those anti-aging qualities. And so by limiting, because there is no human dietary requirement for sugar and starch in any way, in any medical textbook of any book of physiology anywhere, there really is no human dietary requirement for carbohydrates. And because they can have an adverse effect on longevity, and because they attract inflammation, because they're glycating in effect, and can also destabilize the brain and nervous system, and adversely impact the functioning of the brain and nervous system. To me, it is a quote-unquote no-brainer to leave them out of my diet as much as possible.
Okay.
What I do also is I moderate my protein intake. I consume enough protein from animal source foods, which I believe we are very, very well designed to do. And I eat enough to meet those requirements for maintenance and repair, but I don't regularly exceed those requirements. I eat just enough so that I'm not triggering. I'm able to repair and regenerate, but I'm not triggering that mTOR pathway habitually anyway. And then I'll eat as much fat as I need to from a variety of natural sources that are unadulterated, that make sure that I'm meeting my essential fatty acid requirements and that I'm satisfying my appetite. Because fat's a free fuel in this equation. It isn't really involved in these mechanisms that affect our longevity. So fat's kind of, something that's okay.
Okay.
But, I don't necessarily advocate for tons and tons of fat or drinking lard or anything like that. It's eating enough to satisfy your appetite and meet your basic requirements. And in turn also relying upon fat as a primary source of fuel for the brain and for the rest of the body.
Okay.
And then I eat a ton of fresh, fibrous vegetables and greens, probably more than our ancestors ever did. And that has to do with the other thing I took into account, which is the world that we live in today. With all of the toxic onslaught, with the incredible exposure that we have to pesticides and chemicals and contaminants in our air, water, and food supply, that I think that phytonutrients and antioxidants are more important to us now than they ever used to be. And therefore, if you were to look at my plate, you'd probably see more plant material on there than anything else. But the primary caloric source where I'm getting the vast majority of my calories is actually dietary fat.
Okay, dietary fat. Okay, at one time you made an analogy about the fat-based diet as fuel on a wooden stove. Would you share this concept with our listening audience?
Right. So for those that have not heard me use this analogy before, which I think is a useful analogy to describe why I believe fat is the better fuel, that carbohydrates are basically the equivalent, if you will, of metabolic kindling. Your whole grains, your beans, your brown rice, your sweet potatoes and things of that nature are basically the equivalent of taking twigs and throwing those on your metabolic fire. Now, white potatoes, white rice, pasta bread, white potatoes, things like that are basically the metabolic equivalent of taking crumpled up paper and throwing that on your metabolic fire. And if you had a wood stove that you needed to use in order to heat your home, and all you had was kindling to run that wood stove to heat your home with, you could certainly do that. But what would your life look like? You would be in front of that wood stove all the time, looking for where the next handful of fuel was going to come from to keep the fire going. And it's not an efficient way to live. To me, it's like a form of enslavement. And what you're talking about when you're talking about carbohydrates is something that is a fuel that if you are relying on sugar as your primary source of fuel, you are relying upon a fuel that is going to keep you more or less perpetually hungry, that you are going to have to manage all day long. You're going to have some measure of preoccupation, whether you do or not, of making sure that you're constantly throwing, more twigs, hopefully twigs onto that fire, to try to keep the fire burning. But say, for instance, you try to go to bed and sleep through the night, for instance, and there's an analogy here to be made. Suddenly you wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and you're anxious, an analogy there too, and you go running to the wood stove and you look and, oh my God, the fire's going out, and you're grabbing handfuls of paper and lighter fluid or whatever. And, things like alcohol and sugary beverages and sports drinks and crap like that are all basically a little bit like throwing lighter fluid or gasoline on that metabolic fire. I actually think that is the primary mechanism behind alcoholism. Isn't really alcohol. It is a blood sugar problem, a very severe blood sugar problem. And we can all spend our lives managing our blood sugar by constantly tending to that wood stove. But what's the alternative? The alternative is taking maybe a nice big fat log and throwing that on the fire instead. And suddenly, you can walk away from the thing and have a life. You're free. You have a lot more wiggle room with respect to the amount of attention you need to be giving to that wood stove. And you can sleep through the night, and you wake up in the morning and you look inside, the wood box there, and it's like, oh yeah, the fire's burning down. I'll just throw another log on the fire. And then you go about your business. And that is kind of the big difference in my mind with respect to what type of fuel we're relying on. We are taught by mainstream medicine and through mainstream dietitians and things of that nature that we all have to have glucose in order to function, that glucose is the brain's and body's primary source of fuel, and that is a completely misleading statement. It is only true if we have cultivated a dependence on sugar as a primary source of fuel by what it is we choose to habitually eat. And I would say probably 99% of people in our culture are relying on sugar as a primary source of fuel, but our primary design is that of a fat burner, not a sugar burner. We're actually designed to run most efficiently on fat as a primary source of fuel and use sugar only as an auxiliary fuel. It's like rocket fuel that we can have in storage in our glycogen stores, for instance, in case of an emergency, in case of that emergency. Otherwise, keep the emergency fuel in reserve and just run on fat. Even the thinnest person paying attention to this interview probably has a good 100,000 calories worth of fat on their body that they could be drawing from at any given time, in order to just, to energize their day, to energize their brains. But if you're constantly relying on sugar, here's another analogy. We've all seen these big 18-wheel super tankers going down the road carrying gasoline. Well, those trucks aren't really tapping into the thousands of gallons of fuel that they're carrying around. They've got a tiny little tank that they have to stop and refill all the time. And unfortunately, that's kind of the way people operate in our culture. They may have one hell of a super tanker, on them, And they may have almost no access to that fuel because they're busy. They're busy burning a different fuel, compartmentalized by a different, set of enzymes. And so it's a matter of cultivating a dependence on fat as opposed to sugar. And in order to do that, you have to get away from exposure to that fuel that you want to burn less of. I mean, really, if you want to get good at burning fat, and who doesn't, you don't get good at burning fat by burning sugar all the time. You don't get good at playing basketball by playing golf. You get good at doing something by doing it.
Okay.
And so by taking sugar and starch out of your diet to the extent possible, and then relying on fat as a primary source of fuel instead, you cultivate that fat-based metabolism. And then you're really free, because as long as you're consuming enough fat, because fat, we're ice age beings. Fat to our physiological makeup basically means survival.
Mm-hmm.
It's critical for the functioning of our brain and nervous system. We would not have the large brain we do as humans were it not for the amount of fat that we consumed as an evolving species. The brain and nervous system use 20 to 30% of all of our energy supplies, versus a next closest primate relative, the chimpanzees and other primates that use maybe 8%. Their brains maybe use 8% of their total energy needs.
Okay.
Brains for us are very expensive. They require a lot of energy.
Mm-hmm.
And fat has more than twice the calories per gram of sugar. It's also very clean burning fuel. It doesn't damage our tissues at the same time it's supplying us with energy the way sugar does.
Mm-hmm.
It's very even burning. You can have long-lasting, even-burning energy even in the absence of regular meals, because you've figured out how to tap into the rest of your supertanker.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're able to make better choices about what you eat.
Okay.
You're not hungry all the time. So that's the basis of the dietary philosophy. And we're just talking about things from a macronutrient perspective.
Mm-hmm.
I don't look at everything from a macronutrient perspective, but that's kind of the basic formula, at least from the standpoint of what types of calories occupy my plate when I eat.
Okay.
But obviously we have to pay a special attention to nutrient density as well, and other micronutrients that play a role in how we feel and function.
Mm-hmm.
And where that food comes from
mm-hmm.
is massively important.
Yes, I agree with that.
At least as important,
mm-hmm.
if not more important, than the macronutrient ratios that we employ.
Mm-hmm. Now, how do you measure your success in your diet right now?
How do I measure it?
Yes.
I do run periodic expanded functional blood chemistries on myself. It's my way of doing my own kind of personal checkup just to see how things are going. But obviously I rely a lot on how I'm feeling and functioning in my life.
Okay.
I've learned to listen well to my body and to, what's going on. And if I wake up and I'm, in a bad mood or, whatever is going on, rather than try to attribute that to the circumstances of my life, I'm really paying attention to, okay, what did I eat yesterday?
Mm-hmm.
So I've done a lot of work to test myself
mm-hmm.
In a variety of ways: expanded functional blood chemistry analysis, all kinds of immunologic testing to determine where I may have immune reactivities to certain foods, which is an extremely rampant problem today. Mm-hmm. I've done all kinds of adrenal testing on myself. I've looked at other, hormonal profiles to just sort of get a sense of what's going on and what do I need to do in order to better balance that.
Mm-hmm.
But the bottom line is always, how do we feel and function in life?
Yes.
And it's a process of constantly making little adjustments and learning new things.
Mm-hmm.
And then applying that knowledge in a way that just kind of continually is able to improve.
Mm-hmm.
What I've already built for myself.
Yeah.
But how well I sleep,
mm-hmm.
My mood, my cognitive functioning, and all of the things that most of us would kind of look at in terms of, how do I know that I'm well or not, are the same kinds of things that I rely upon to monitor my own well-being.
Okay. So you were like your own ambassador. You
I try to be, yes. And I truly am, quite consistent with the dietary principles that I talk about.
Mm-hmm.
We all have our sort of pet indulgences, but I don't, I don't eat grains, rice, beans. I don't eat refined sugar, anything like that ever.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, ever.
Okay.
The things that I know I have an immune reactivity to, I avoid. I just point blank. I've looked at those things, especially the gluten cross-reactive related kinds of antigens, and I've had that meeting with myself where it's like, okay, I will never eat those things again as long as I live,
Mm-hmm.
and that's just that. And I'm gonna pull up my big girl panties, and that's just the way it's going to be.
Wow, big girl panties. Now, were you?
Yeah.
You seem very confident now. Were you always that way?
I've learned enough to be confident in some of what I know, and I've also lived long enough, and I've learned enough to know there's a lot more that we all need to learn. And I'm always open to learning new things and to adjusting my way of looking at things relative to new information. And there's always new information, and that's exciting to me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm willing to be open-minded enough to even look at a point of view I don't think that I agree with, and just kind of consider, well, is there an aspect to this that might be true, or is there some way in which I need to adjust my thinking to account for this or whatever?
Mm-hmm.
And I really try to be honest with myself when it comes to that. And it is an effort, because we're all prone to confirmation bias. We're all prone to looking for things that are going to confirm our point of view and ignoring the things that contradict that.
Right.
I work really hard at trying to be mindful of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I can happily say that I've seen enough positive results in myself and others that I've worked with and received feedback from over the years now.
Wow.
That I know I'm on the right track.
Wow.
Whether I have it 100% right or not, remains to be seen. I mean, nobody has that 100% right.
Yes.
I'm constantly adjusting.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm a great dot connector. I'm a great researcher. I'm willing to learn from my own mistakes. And I'm willing to adjust what may have been previous assumptions for me that I, recognize, okay, well, maybe that really wasn't the case.
Mm-hmm.
How do I need to adjust my thinking?
Mm-hmm.
And so I've learned.
Yes. So you are an ambassador.
I try to be.
Yes, try to be. Yes. Thank you for your positivity.
Yeah.
Yes, and honesty. Yes, our readers like that, or our listeners like that. Yes. Thank you. Now, where can our listeners go to learn more about you?
Well, of course, I have my website, primalbody-primalmind.com, and there's a lot of free information, tons of articles, and I also had my own radio show for a period of time, and there are quite a number of available free podcasts there, in addition to other audio broadcasts of interviews I've done, quite a number of videos available, including certain presentations on specific topics. And I also have my book, Primal Body, Primal Mind, Beyond the Paleo Diet for Total Health and a Longer Life, that is still ranked very highly in health-related books, even though it's been out for a few years now. I have my ebook, Rethinking Fatigue, what your adrenals are really telling you and what you can do about it. Mm-hmm. Now, Primal Body, Primal Mind actually spent a whole week at #1 on Amazon in all the health-related categories, and it was #8 in books overall for a period of time. So, it's done quite well. Rethinking Fatigue was also #1 in endocrinology and metabolism for quite a long time. But at any rate, those books are both available through my website, and Primal Body, Primal Mind is also in all the bookstores, and you can find it on Amazon. It's everywhere. I also co-authored, this doesn't really help the listeners here in the States, but I co-authored a book with a celebrity in Australia that actually just spent several weeks at the #1 book in Australia.
Wow.
It's called Going Paleo.
Mm-hmm.
And that has done extremely well over there and continues to do extremely well over there. But unfortunately, it's not really available here. But if some of your listeners happen to be from down under, then that would be another resource. I also have a chapter that I've written for a book on neurofeedback that is coming out in the not too distant future. It's going to be released actually next month. And that's more of an academic book,
Mm-hmm.
written more from the perspective of practitioners and researchers. But I contributed a chapter on nutrition and mental health from the standpoint of being a neurofeedback provider and how neurofeedback providers can augment what they're accomplishing with their clients and patients through the application of some basic nutritional principles, and some of my discoveries along those lines. And I am also in the middle right now of writing my next full-length book for Simon & Schuster. And it's, we're a year out from that book being out, and I'm not yet talking about what the book is actually called and what it's about, but that'll be maybe another interview.
Okay, sounds good.
It's all going well.
Great, I'm happy for you.
There's one more thing. If people are interested in adopting, this sort of way of life, these dietary principles, they've read my book, for instance, and then their eyes glaze over because they're not quite sure how to apply it. How do I do all of this? And anybody that's read Primal Body, Primal Mind knows it's like 15 or 20 books in one. There's a lot there to digest. I've in collaboration with this celebrity in Australia, we've created a 10-week program with this whole team of people, with some of the best people actually in the world when it comes to websites, when it comes to creating these kinds of programs. It's actually extremely, extremely well done. I'm quite proud of it. We have a 10-week online program, and it's actually in US dollars about $89 for the 10 weeks. And you're basically handheld through the process of adopting this way of life. There is also a private online forum in which people can have a community and also ask questions. We have doctors, we have naturopaths, we have other performance people, fitness people, providing support and extra information and extra help for people in the program. The recipes are to die for. Just absolutely superb.
Mm.
You just want to eat them right off the screen.
You're making me hungry.
And they were created by a real chef, a celebrity chef,
Mm-hmm.
Pete Evans, who is
I
just
know him.
So gifted in creating food that is just so easy to produce, so easy to prepare and affordable, and makes it fun and sexy and makes it all very compelling. Mm-hmm. And so it's like a complete toolkit for anybody that wants to adopt this way of life.
Mm-hmm.
And right now I spend a few hours a week basically hand-holding people and answering their questions on that forum. We have tens of thousands of people already signed up, actually,
wow.
for that program, and it's going extremely well. The results have been amazing.
Mm-hmm.
When I was in Australia recently, we did a tour. I toured many cities in Australia and New Zealand, promoting this whole thing, and we'd already had quite a number of people who had been exposed to all this and were adopting this way of life. And in Sydney, we had close to 1,300 people in the audience. And at one point, we asked them how many people here have actually adopted this sort of dietary approach, and virtually the entire audience stood up. Everybody was standing up.
Wow.
We asked then for a show of hands for how many of these people this, really didn't do anything for them. They didn't notice any benefits, and they weren't helped in any way. Not a single hand went up.
Okay.
which
Great.
was pretty exciting.
Yes.
And I'm not saying that's always the case, but really, I think if you do this right, there's very little risk of downside.
Wow. This is...
Oh, and if you want to sign up for that program, you can go to www.thepaleoway.com.
Okay.
THE Paleoway, WAY.com.
Okay.
And you can sign up there.
Okay. That's good information.
Yes.
Thank you so much for sharing.
You're so very, very welcome.
And Nora, thank you for all the valuable information that you have presented to us today. And
you're so welcome.
Yes, and we thank you and have a great day, and I wish you the best of success on your new book.
Thank you so much, Rosanna. Appreciate it.